right, good morning. Welcome to the Humanist Community in Silicon Valley's Sunday Forum. My name is Matt Courtney. I'm the recorder and a member of the board of the Humanist Community. The Humanist Community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist Community if you've not already done so. Membership forms are available on our website, humanists.org. That's humanists plural. If you're listening for the first time, welcome, and we invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website, humanists.org. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist Community. You can find out how to donate to our organization, again, on the website humanists.org. Professor Elizabeth Drescher will discuss atheism in America. And you can go ahead, Elizabeth. You should be able to unmute.
Right on.
Take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen, but welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Let me make sure the sharing happens. Okay, so I haven't met any of you, although some years ago I did come to some of your meetings, but haven't for a while. However, many of my students at Santa Clara have. And I've been so grateful for their engagement with this group and other secular groups that have enriched my teaching considerably and exposed students, whether they're religious or not religious, to a whole new range of human experience that they generally haven't known about. So first of all, I just want to say I've been so grateful to groups like yours for welcoming our students and providing them the opportunity to understand a broader range of human experience. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach teaching about non-religion in its various forms at Santa Clara, which many of you may know is a Catholic university in the Jesuit tradition. And over the last about 8 years, I've been teaching about different modes of changing religiosity. Our students are required to take 3 religion courses during their undergraduate career, which I think of as the Religion Scholars Full Employment Act of Santa Clara University. So that's been good for me. However, as you're probably aware, the population of the United States overall has been changing dramatically over the last about 30 years in terms of religiosity, and even more so among students, and that's certainly been the case among my students. And as that change has unfolded, it's impacted my classrooms and my teaching about non-religion. So just by way of understanding a little bit about our student population, at Santa Clara, early on when I started teaching this class, I do a survey of students in all of my classes every quarter just to get a sense of where they are on the religious spectrum. So when I started teaching this course several years back, I picked it up from a faculty member who had been teaching a version of the course, and I'll talk about the way that courses have changed, but over time, but I picked up his course, which was at the time called Religion and Secularism. And it was not a particularly popular course. And it had just a handful of students, most of them identified as religiously affiliated, and very few of them were women. That all of that has changed over time as the course has changed, but I think probably more significantly as students' religiosity has changed. So I changed up the course after that, and more students who identified as religiously unaffiliated in various ways started attending, and more women started attending. And that's actually been probably at least as big a trend line. The fact that more women are taking a course that's focused on non-religion than men has been significant, I think, both in terms of the way religion and non-religion are understood in America, but also in terms of the way that non-religious communities themselves have changed over the last decade or so. More recently, we've added, I taught one section of this course at the beginning, and then we added two, and I now teach it 4 times a year. And the courses are jam-packed, and they're jam-packed with students who mainly identify as one kind of non-religious or another. In the university overall, about 60% of our students identify as religiously affiliated. About 40% out of that 60% are some kind of Catholic. Of course, that doesn't indicate how devout they are in their practice, but it looks like the course has come to be identified as a place for non-religious students to be able to explore their own various identities as non-religious. So that's a little bit about who we are. So as I mentioned, the course started out as being about religion and secularism. I picked it up from a colleague who went to another institution, and it was, depending on what you know about the Jesuits, they're especially at Santa Clara, they're a pretty religiously open organization. There's not a lot of hostility toward other religions or forms of secularism. However, the course was taught as a low-key, I would say, as a low-key argument against non-religion. So the reading was focused on, the Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris oeuvre, situated against scholars like Terry Eagleton or Christian Smith, who have a good understanding of secularism, but ultimately are arguing against it in various ways. And not out of, well, probably, I was going to say not of any ideological bias per se, but certainly in some ways. The way that I approach the study of religion and non-religion is to look at what actual people are doing in the context of their lives. So I wanted to move away from that sort of polemic structure of the course. I redeveloped the course later as a course called Atheism in America, because that's what was in the catalog previously from who knows when, and it's really hard to change the names of courses. However, starting in the fall, it's taken me that long, I'm focusing, the course is renamed Nonreligion in America, and it has a broader focus. So I'm going to talk through some of that shift. As I noted, the religion and secularism course started out as this polemical course. Early on, I kind of dropped that structure and made it more case-based, and it had a global focus. So I looked at cases where across the world where religion and secularism had come into conflict, and looked at how that began to shape different modes of cultural experience. I looked at the way in which students looked at the way in which secularism grew out of religiosity or not, and looked at the ways it had changed over time. And in lots of ways, it was a really interesting class. However, we're on the quarter system, so we have 11 weeks, which really, given students adding and dropping and then floating other ways through the quarter, works out to be about 8 or 9 weeks of productive engagement. And I felt like the course was just too big for that context. But also, as more students started taking the course, many of whom were non-religious, they were really interested in exploring what that identity meant for them in their lives. They had really limited awareness of institutional forms of non-religion, like your groups. And since my own research and writing has been grounded, again, as I mentioned before, in understanding how ordinary people engage the world and the tools and social structures that they use to do that. And I've done a lot of ethnographic work. I was interested in doing that. So when I rebooted it as Atheism in America, I took up this more field-based approach using ethnographical tools. Still did a lot of historical and political background on the American context, which is, of course, very different than the secular context of Europe or of Asia. But the big shift was that I started asking students to visit with groups like yours so that they could see real, live, non-religious people in their more or less natural habitats and start to understand what being non-religious meant to people. And although the course was per the catalog called Atheism in America, I began to define non-religious experience more broadly with students to look at basically the different ways in which people in the United States identify as non-religious. So really starting, historically from the name that never caught on, Nothing-agarians, don't know why, to people who identified as secular and humanist and secular humanists and atheists and agnostics and the whole range of identities. And we started to look at, well, what does that mean in people's lives to identify in that way? That has grown into the course that is now formally non-religion in America. It's still going to be field-based. Over the last year, of course, we were doing virtual field work. And so students visited meetings like this. The kind of super cool thing about that is I am, as a researcher, a localist. That is, I look at religious phenomenon where I am. So I'm interested in the religious and non-religious landscape of Silicon Valley. And so students, and as a practical matter, would visit with groups in the Silicon Valley where we were doing face-to-face work, and fingers crossed they'll be doing that in the fall as well. But over the last year, because we've been online, students have really been able to go. I tried initially to maintain that kind of local focus, and some students did. But others who were in other places in the country really wanted to understand non-religious experience where they were. And so that opened up the field research in the last year so that, in particular, students could take a look at non-religious organizations and their members and participants in parts of the country that are less progressive than Northern California. And so that gave them the opportunity to see why the institutionalization of non-religion is important in different ways, depending on what kinds of experiences people have and what the religious landscape is of a different area. So I'm going to actually continue to do that and have students do local field work, but I'll also have them do some comparative field work, visiting with non-religious organizations where they're able in other parts of the country. I also, initially the approach in the class was to position various kinds of institutional and extra-institutional non-religion as part of a pluralist landscape that said, there's lots of different kinds of religions, there's lots of different ways of being non-religious, kind of can't we all just get along, to a more cosmopolitan approach that's really more about how do we engage with one another. And so as the course has developed, we've been looking more at how non-religious communities are engaged in practices of social justice and political action, along often with religious and other secular groups, and how that's changing both religion and non-religion as practices in the United States. So we've visited with all kinds of different groups, locally and now nationally. Students do 3 field visits during the course. So they visit 2 different organizations, and then they do a follow-up visit with one of those organizations, and they often do interviews. We do have students build a survey of our students as well, and so every year we do a student survey built by students to assess the changing religious landscape on campus and the different non-religious identities there. So that balance of looking at what's in the immediate landscape in terms of non-religion has been really productive, and then we look at that in relation to what's the non-religious character of our campus. And the really super interesting, like 100%, I know this, 100 students have no idea organizations like yours exist, none. And so one of the really interesting things in the course is that students, get to know different organizations. They're as unlikely to join them as they are unlikely to join a church. Gen Z, lack of interest in institutional practices of almost anything. It persists, but students have gone back to different organizations for different kinds of activities and to learn more, and they really super love meeting grown-ups who are non-religious and kind of hearing the story about non-religion. So that's been a big feature of the course. However, one of the ways that students have changed over the years that I've been teaching it is that in the beginning of the course, students were often leaving a religious background to identify as non-religious in different ways. Increasingly, students have at least one parent who is non-religious, and often 2, and often they've been raised in a non-religious background. So for some students, engaging with organizations like yours and the folks in them has to do with for the very first time meeting a grown-up who identifies as non-religious and understanding how you all maybe have come to this identification. But for others, it really is just affirming what may already have been a reality in their families, and I expect that to continue to be the case. We do a lot of reading in the course as well to get a sense of historically and politically how has non-religion developed in the United States. We don't read all of these. We read all of Godless Citizens, but snippets from other books. So we want to know some of the historical background of non-religion in America. I also do a piece that largely draws on Pascal Boyer's work on the evolutionary background of religious and religious and non-religious engagement in the world. Boyer, you may know, is an anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist who really looks at issues in the culture and how evolution cultivates different approaches to a reality. So we look at that. We've increasingly been looking at how can we look at more diverse expressions of non-religion in America. As I noted, when I was first teaching the course, it was pretty dude heavy. And most non-religious organizations were themselves pretty dude heavy and also pretty white. That's, as you're probably aware, has changed dramatically just in the last 5 or 6 years. So we've been looking at those kinds of changes as well. And then through my book and more recently, Tara Burton's Strange Rights, which came out last year, we've been looking at institutional non-religious practices and how that's changing over time. So that's pretty much a high level. I'm going to stop sharing now because it's the end of my slides, but a high level look at how the course is developed, some of how students have changed and how I've approached that. And I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts and insights about that.
All right, we'll go into the Q&A section. So if you have a question, click on the reaction buttons and then click the raise hand button. That's for PC and Mac. On iPads or such, I think the raise hand button's in a different place. You'll have to search for it. I don't know where it is. But we have Ray as the first question.
Yes. Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for your talk. I'd like to know about your awareness of other courses like yours in other Bay Area institutions of higher learning and anything you know about their history, and wondering if you compare notes with any of them, if there are any.
You know what? I'm not aware offhand. There are in political. I'm not aware in great depth. UC Berkeley has some courses within political science on secularism, and so they're really focused, as far as I can tell from their syllabi, they're focused on looking at things like church-state relations and how that impacts political processes. There are some courses at Stanford that cover the same ground. So that's about my awareness. When I was developing the course, I actually did a lot of looking around for courses that had a more social scientific ethnographic approach. Part of that is because the role of the religious studies requirement in our curriculum relates to the Jesuit value of educating the whole person and preparing people to engage in a diverse and complex world. And so we're really more interested in the in our department, in the sociocultural elements of religion and non-religion and how they work in students' lives. And so I'm not seeing that elsewhere in the Bay Area per se, but I'd be sure happy to know about it if somebody did know about that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, I got one from Carl. Carl, you should be able to unmute.
Okay, let me see here. Hold on.
Yep, you're
Oh,
good.
it came through now. I was blocked. Yeah, I just want to know, Elizabeth, about one question I had. When you have your students come in and you say they have more mixed backgrounds, do they explain to you what it is they expect to get out of the course? I was just curious. In other words, they must have signed up for a reason, and you said a lot of people do. Because, you know, like when I was in college, a lot of people signed up for psychology, not because they wanted to become have a psychological career, because they wanted to know something about it or something about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's my question.
Well, there's a range of expectations. I do talk with students about what they're hoping to learn in the class and why they signed up for it. You know, it's a requirement in the core curriculum, so there's a lot of like it fit in my schedule, if they're really being honest. However, because a lot of our students come from, whether they were Catholic or not, come from a background in Catholic schools and often Jesuit schools, many of them have had a lot of religion classes. So often what I hear from students is they were interested because they have to take these 3 religion requirements and they're so sick of taking religion classes that they thought a class on non-religion would be a break from that. So that's one motivation. Another motivation increasingly is that students themselves identify as non-religious, and they're not aware that non-religion has a particular history in the United States. You know, you're probably aware, we have a pretty free market religious landscape that involves, you know, just picking the assumption that you just choose the one that you like best, whether that's religion or non-religion. And so it's fairly consumerist in that way. And so there's not a realization that you know, that there were pivotal moments in the development of the United States that shape the particular approach to religion and non-religion that we have, and they're really interested in that. Some students are really excited when they see that the course does include engaging with people in non-religious organizations, and they're interested in finding out more about them. So there's a variety of interests there. We have a fairly small cohort of evangelical Christian students on campus, and they often take the course by way of developing background information for proselytizing, basically. So even though we don't do that kind of argumentation in the course, you know, it's pretty, you know, you can tell by student questions, you know, when they're asking, well, how would you argue against this, you know, materialist understanding of reality and human experience, for example, that you can sort of tell that. So there's a range.
Okay.
It looked like Helen had a question.
Does Helen have a question? Okay. I have asked her to mute. Okay.
I guess it's been a few years, a few course years or academic years since we had Nancy Unger, who speaks on social history. And she has come and spoken to our group many times, and we were in Palo Alto, San Jose, live. And so I guess that's a reason why current students are not aware of our group near in their backyard, so to speak.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
she has often told them, okay, I'm going to speak at the humanist community in Silicon Valley this Sunday. I'll show up.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that as I noted when I was speaking before, just generationally, students are not particularly interested in institutions. So we've seen that playing out over the last 30 to 50 years for all kinds of institutions, and I often half joke that if I could figure out, because I have students in my, I also teach religion in America and other courses that are more focused on religion than on non-religion. And I have students do field work in those courses as well. And I often joke that if I could figure out how to monetize sending my students to churches, I'd be broadcasting from my vacation home in Maui, because 18 to 22-year-olds aren't any more interested in religious institutions than they are in non-religious institutions. That's just not how they gather. That's not how they cultivate social experience. It's not how they do ritualize things in their lives. So their lack of awareness of institutions isn't about, it's partly about the ways in which different kinds of institutions market themselves and become known on the mostly social media platforms and other modes of engagement that young people do access. But it's largely that even when they might see those kinds of things, it doesn't feel like the way that they do it. Having a class in which they're invited to go to different places does give them a different kind of exposure. And they recognize that when they come to groups like this, or the Ethical Culture Society, or things like that, they don't see a lot of young people. So it's pretty clear that it's not their space. Although in the next year, we're doing more work with the Student Secular Society to engage more at a younger level, at a more peer group level.
Okay. Dana and Jerry?
Yeah, Jerry here. Yeah, I was curious, humanists have a variety of perspectives on religious people. So I'm kind of wondering about the perspectives that religious people have on non-religious. Do they see us as poor, ignorant fools, or an exotic foreign species, or something else?
Well, it's certainly a range. Because there's a strong emphasis in our religious studies courses across the board on pluralism, increasingly on kinds of cosmopolitanism, where people are actually changed by the encounter rather than just acknowledging the encounter. And most of our students are reasonably progressive. So they're unlikely to be overtly hostile toward the non-religious. However, there is a sense among some students of non-religion, of not understanding how religious people cultivate ethical structures and moral practices. So that's one of the things that we look at. They're usually super surprised that non-religious people would have any kinds of common ritual practices to mark life transitions, and things like that. And that's whether they identify as religious or non-religious. So I would say there's not hostility. There's sometimes a kind of pitying sort of mode, like, oh, they just don't get it. They don't have the richness of having God or religion in their lives. But that's less frequent. They don't know that there are a range of approaches to non-religious practice. They're not, they know generally about atheists, which they think of as, in the Hitchens Dawkins mode, as being, new atheism really influenced a kind of strong, often negative perception of the non-religious, despite lots of other kinds of ways that it created visibility for the non-religious. So they have that caricature. They tend to understand agnosticism as the sort of kinder, gentler new atheism. They're not aware of humanism at all, or things like ethical culture. So part of the history is just saying, how do these things develop over time, in the United States? How do non-religious people come to identify in the ways that they do? So I don't think there's an overall, antipathy toward the non-religious. I think they're pretty open and curious about it. And they're super surprised. I have to say, I mentioned that, they come into a group like this and they see there aren't college-age people here. There aren't younger people here. And so that's something that might be off-putting. They're always, though, really grateful for the welcome they get, and they're super surprised when they see older people who are non-religious, because they think of it as a phenomenon of youth. And so they'll say, I saw this dude, like, he's older than my grandfather, and he was non-religious back before that was a thing. And so sort of recognizing, like, no, actually, this has been, a thing for, a really super long, since the Pilgrims, literally, since before that. So this has been a thing for a long time. And maybe what we're seeing is a greater recognition, a greater openness. But, I don't know, maybe ask your grandpa, maybe you'd be surprised.
So would you say that they kind of view the non-religious as less alien after visits?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And just seeing that, I mentioned one of the good things about this year of online learning that has, in my estimation, very few good things, but is that they've been able to see non-religious groups in other parts of the country. And so one of the students, his home happens to be in Alabama. So that's where he was this year when he took the course, and they visited, his group visited with a non-religious, an atheist group in Alabama, and to see the way in which, like, there's active persecution, like people are afraid about losing their jobs, and students are shocked about that. They're outraged by it. So it's not just seeing the humanity of the non-religious and thinking, oh, these are ordinary people just like everybody else. They're, they don't eat babies. They have a sense of, often, they have a sense of moral life. They have ways of engaging and gathering with people. They do all these kinds of things, but also there are parts of the United States where they're still subject to discrimination and sometimes outright persecution. And, the kind of social justice orientation that most of our students have is really activated by that. So it's both coming to respect the diversity of the non-religious, but also just seeing that the openness that they might see somewhere in the Bay Area has come historically at a great price for many people.
Yeah, that's all good to know. And one of the stronger images I have about religious people is they don't understand how somebody could be non-religious and not commit murder.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm done. Do you have anything? Okay.
Well, I was thinking about existentialism and how that fit into it.
It comes up some. There's actually we have a philosophy course on existentialism, and I sometimes have the guy who does that class do a brief lecture on that. But it'll come up as students. I mean, it comes up in terms of how that European tradition comes to shape American practices. Largely in the early mid 20th century, so historically, but it comes up as students actually engage people in non-religious communities and talk about how they approach, what their ideological and ethical framework is for dealing with their lives.
Are you done? Okay, we're done. Thank you.
All right. Back to Ray.
Okay, next question I have a little more personal in nature. Wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your journey. Were your parents religious? How were you raised? And are you still religious? Have you gone away from religion? And if so, what were some of the things that had an effect on any transition you may have had?
Oh, wow. That's it's a big question. It has I think a 2-drink minimum and a couple therapy sessions with it. So as a requirement. So my dad was Catholic. My mom was Jewish-ish, both of them. So I was raised Catholic-ish, but both of my parents, came of age during World War II. My mom sort of rejected religion out of the sense of the sort of failure of God that a lot of people saw in Nazism and that engagement. If the language had been around at the time, she might have identified as spiritual but not religious. She nominally converted to Catholicism when she married my dad, but never went to church. And my dad was engaged I grew up in a very small town on the Pennsylvania-Ohio border. And my dad was engaged in that kind of community building way in the local congregation, local Catholic parish that we were members of. So all of that is to say, I was raised in a religion-ish household, but also invited to be curious about other religious traditions. Probably after high school, I guess I would have thought of myself as not really religious, but maybe a little spiritual. It was just clear for me at a fairly early age that, in lots of ways as a woman, as a feminist, I was not welcome in the Catholic Church. I didn't have hostility toward it. I was just like, not really. There's not a place for me. So I wasn't actively religious all through college and graduate school. At a certain point in my life, I got connected to an Episcopal community that I really liked, largely because they did a lot of social justice work. And that felt like a place where I could do that. This is a second career for me. I was working in a corporate job then. And when I started getting involved with this Episcopal community, I actually had this thought about why am I doing this? Why would I'm a lesbian, I'm a feminist, I'm vaguely Marxist. You know, why am I doing this? And that's when I started studying religion, because I wanted to understand what, how, you know, how this could make sense to someone. I was also getting ready to leave the career that I was in. And I was interested in how the people I worked with were making ethical sense of their lives and how religion played a role in that. So I started studying religion as kind of nominally Episcopalian, and I was pretty engaged in that practice all the way through my PhD, and then I just found that it didn't work in terms of, I mean, it did a lot of really good things, but I in lots of ways, you know, one of course, the risks of studying religion is that you see behind the curtain. So once you see the social structuring, at least for me, the social structuring of religion, how it functions politically and culturally, it just became less of an organizing force in my life. There's a lot still I identify, you know, I'm an American, so I'm shaped by Christianity and its Protestant forms in lots of ways. You know, and I find a lot of those practices meaningful in lots of ways. But I don't, if there were a community that were engaged in the world in the way that I think it's important to do work in the world, I might still do that. But I haven't. So I think of myself as kind of an Episcopalian-ish skeptic in that sense.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Mark.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask an interesting question here from my point of view, is that I know you decided to teach a course in non-religion at such a profoundly religious institution. How receptive was the university to you having that idea to teach such a course?
You know, actually my chair asked me to teach it. So, you know, pretty receptive. I don't have any numbers on this, and I'm not speaking for my department, but a lot of religious studies faculty are not particularly religious for the reason that I just identified, perhaps even at a Jesuit university. Many are, but the reason that my chair asked me to teach the course was twofold. One is it's really clear that our student population is increasingly non-religious. And he recognized that if we wanted to engage students in the kind of personal development and cultural development and ethical development that it really is our purpose in the university, that we had to meet them there. So that was on the one hand, because I you know, my own research is on the changing American religious landscape, and that is increasingly a non-religious landscape. You know, he felt like that was something that I can do. I don't think that he had the expectation that it would kind of move in the direction that he did, but there's not been any hesitation about teaching the course in the university. I mean, I have some colleagues who are more, you know, deeply religious in their traditions that, you know, wouldn't advise students to take the course, I would say, but there's not hostility toward it overall.
Okay. We have Herman. Go ahead when you unmute yourself.
I'm wondering, how do you deal with superstition, which is often associated with religion? I also like to comment that early in your talk, you used the expression knock on wood. How do you justify using something like that?
Well, I'm going to say two things. We don't know that there aren't fairies in the woods, in wood, that we're activating, but so that. So I address superstition a lot through Pascal Boyer's work. So Boyer talks in explaining religion about the ways in which our cognitive wiring invites us to perceive the presence of supernatural beings in various natural phenomena. So I look at it, I present it in that way. On the one hand, on the other hand, there are lots of cultural idioms that we use, right? So when I say knock on wood, we generally accept that I don't actually believe that there are animate spirits in wood that I'm going to release by knocking on wood so that they can enchant my life in some way. We generally know that I hope so. That's its cultural meaning at the present time. In the same way, in my research among the non-religious, lots of non-religious people, including those who identify as atheists, as hard atheists, will say that they pray. They quote unquote pray. And that sort of raises the question like, well, who are you praying to? But when you dive into the practices that they're doing and their interpretations of those practices, what I identified is that in the English language, we don't have another term that says, I am focused on both the paradox of hope and anxiety around a certain life situation. And so when I am praying, I am not necessarily praying to a supernatural being or force to intervene in some way. I am doing a practice that articulates this paradoxical experience of fear and hope that sounds more like an expression of compassion and caring than I'm thinking about you. And so the language changes over time so that we have certain cultural idioms that have meaning. The meaning just isn't the same as it was 50 or 100 or 1,000 years ago.
Okay.
Your mute is still on. You're muted.
Is that Herman?
Yeah, I think.
Thank you for your for your comments, but I would suggest that atheists should still avoid using expressions like that because of their association with religious beliefs, which are so culturally embedded. I had a very personal experience with that. I was raised Jewish. I'm an atheist. Got married, had a child. And in the Jewish tradition, there is a religious ceremony in the 8th day after a male birth. When my wife got pregnant many years ago, there was no sex determination at the time. We decided that we would not have a religious ceremony if it was a boy. Nevertheless, I felt obliged to tell my parents about this because I knew that they would not be happy with this. So it took a lot of courage going to dinner with my parents one Friday night, and when my wife was in her 6th or 7th month, and said, Mom, Dad, if it's a boy, we're not going to have this ceremony. It's called a bris, as you may know, thinking that this would raise all kinds of cries of anguish and pressure on me. Instead, my mother said, "You're not having enough chicken soup." So I repeated it and did my duty. Sure enough, my wife gives birth. It's a boy. And they rush up to the hospital instantly because it's their first male grandchild, and this is a big deal. And they enter my wife's room, don't even pay attention to me or my anyone else. They just say, "Well, here's the list of invitees to the bris, and here's the menu that we're going to provide." And I said, "Don't you remember? I told you that there was going to be no such event." And they said, "You don't understand. We don't discuss plans for an unborn child. It's giving the evil eye. According to their superstitious beliefs, it is not a good idea to discuss any detailed plans for a child. That's up to God. You can't interfere with God's decision on what's going to happen." And I think this is so embedded. I understand, for example, that in Israel, where there are many religious Jews, that there's no such thing as planning and buying furniture for a nursery or having an event. You certainly have the religious, the bris, which we decided we would have that anyway with the obstetrician performing it because it was medically advised at the time. Medical opinions go up and down about circumcision, but at the time we had our son, it was advised, and we asked the obstetrician if he would do it, and he said, sure, he would do it. But my parents were so upset, and they came every day with an increased guest list and menu for the event that was going to be such a big deal for them, until I got here. I was 22, 23 years old, and this was important to me. You know, am I going to knuckle into demands from parents, or am I going to be a man finally? You know, so they kept increasing the pressure on it. Finally, I said, without thinking it through, I said, "Okay, have your goddamn bris. I'm not coming." And that was my solution to it. Whereupon my wife's parents, who were a little more liberal about it, also would have preferred to have a religious bris. And my wife's mother said, "Oh, we have a guy in the family who's a rabbi who does such ceremonies. We can call him, because if there's going to be such an event, it's got to be done by our uncle so-and-so in New Jersey." So I understand they call him, and he said to my mother-in-law, "Where is the event going to be?" And she said, "Where my wife gave birth, which is Women's Hospital, the Upper West Side in New York." I was in my senior year as an undergraduate at Columbia College, and we lived near there, and that was the hospital. And I understand that this rabbi, or Moyle it's called, who does these ceremonies, said when he found out where it was going to be, he said, "They won't let me in there." Why? Because as a very religious Moyle doing the ceremony, he does it in the biblical way. He doesn't use any of the procedures to minimize bloodletting and pain. I exaggerate by saying he does it in the way Abraham did it to Isaac. He looks for a sharp stone on the way to the ceremony, and he picks it up on the way, and that's how he does it. So I decided that this was not the way I wanted my son to be disfigured. I said, "All right, I agree that there would be a bris, but we're going back to plan A. The obstetrician is going to do it, and I'll find a rabbi who will say the appropriate prayers." Easier said than done. I picked up the phone book in New York, looked up for clergymen, rabbis, and began calling them alphabetically. Hello, my name is Herman Winnick. We just had a son, and it's a boy. We're planning on having a bris in a couple of days. And we need a rabbi who will say the prayers because the obstetrician is going to do the cutting. The first 3 or 4 I spoke to just hung up without answering me. One of them said, I've done 6,433 of these. How many has your obstetrician done? So anyway, I ran into this huge opposition to it, but finally found a rabbi fresh out of rabbinical school who needed $25 and came and did it. And I was satisfied, but nobody else was. Nevertheless, that's how we did it.
Well, I think, I think we all have these deep personal connections to how we experience the world and how we come to understand what those experiences mean in our lives. And I can certainly see I can understand that experience would amplify a sense of, like, the literal, not symbolic, right? The literal pain that lots of religious traditions cause in the lives of people. And, because of that, lots of non-religious people that I talk to do hold the perspective that that religious language, religious symbols, religious terminology, religious practices, anything that's associated with religion, even if you're doing it in a way that you identify as non-religious, that reinforces religion in the culture. And that's a dangerous thing. And in fact, part of the critique from within the non-religious community, for example, of Tara Isabel Burton's book on religious practices is exactly that. That these kinds of rituals hearken to religions, and they reinforce their power in the culture, and that's a bad thing. There are lots of other people, however, whose life experiences are different. They've come to see these practices as human practices, as the kind of ritualization of human experience and language around it. And they feel like if non-religious people take up this language, take up these practices, and refuse the religious meanings associated with them, that reduces the power of religion, that it neutralizes it in some ways. The jury's kind of out on that. However, we do have evidence from the ways in which many religions have changed their own practices to suggest that secular or non-religious pressure on religions and appropriations of religious practices will change religion over time into something that's more humanistic, more secular. And you see that, for example, in Judaism, in the move from, just through Reform Judaism into Reconstruction and all of that, the way in which that tradition has moved is the same way in Christianity, from more Orthodox forms into various forms of liberal Protestantism. I don't really have I have a personal perspective on that, but I don't have as a scholar, I don't have a position on that. I'm just interested in hearing stories like yours and other stories that say, this is how people are articulating this. Let's watch this, right? We know that within the non-religious community, there's some people who see the San Francisco Atheist Church and lose it. Really feel like if you call it a church, you're acknowledging that. You're giving churches power. And there are others who say, no, you're taking away power. Church is now a benign thing. But we know that, in San Jose, for example, the San Jose Buddhist church Betsui specifically took up the word church to hearken to Christianity after World War II, right? So we know that power exists in those words. And the question is, when you deploy them, are you reinforcing traditions like some people would say, harming infants in the case of female genital mutilation? Are you reinforcing that? Or are there ways that you can pull the power away from that by, for example, having a naming ceremony or an infant welcome ceremony that hearkens to those religious experiences without taking those practices with them? And we're at this really interesting moment culturally where the religious landscape is changing so dramatically. We're not going to know for at least a generation how those negotiations in the culture are going to play out.
Okay, we got to move on to other people, but thanks, Herman. So Dick, whoops, there we go. Whoops. Hopefully I got it this time. I got a number of misclicks and stuff. Paul, I'm reading you again. Dick, I think you're good.
Thank you. My first question, in some ways, you've responded to in your last discussion, because it has to do with language and how difficult it is to find the right language. You've used an expression several times that I hear all the time, and I am totally confused by it. And that is when people say they're spiritual but not religious. Because in my mind, they're the same thing. And then I have another question after that one.
Okay. Well, etymologically, they're not.
Yeah.
So etymologically, religion comes from the root religio, which has to do with rules. It's a social structuring form, whereas spirit comes from different roots, but has to do with the animating force, the pneuma, the ruach, the animating force in human life, right? So they're not exactly the same. The term spiritual but not religious comes out of the 12-step movement in the 1970s and 80s, as the boomers were getting themselves clean after the 60s. And many of them went into lots of, no kidding, lots of 12-step programs. And as you may be aware, Alcoholics Anonymous comes from a really distinctly Christian tradition. So the original, giving it up to God was a Protestant Methodist, particularly God. That changed to God or a higher power, because the landscape became more diverse. And for boomers who had often rejected formal institutional religions and their rule in the 60s and 70s, this flip of which is in the big book of becoming spiritual but not religious was a way of opening that out to a broader constituency. And so it generally, when people say that, they generally mean I acknowledge some kind of animating life force and not an institutional religious structure per se. And I'm going to do practices that I think cultivate that animating life force. For some people who are non-religious, they think of that as the human spirit. Whatever it is that animates us, we don't quite know. It's not supernatural, but we know that at some moment we're living and at some moment we're dead. And so I want to cultivate that humanness in me. It also can refer to a sense of self-transcendence, which again doesn't have to be a supernatural self-transcendence. It can mean just thinking beyond myself, right? Thinking about a wider sense of existential experience and the cultivation of that human spirit, or increasingly the more than human spirit, the spirit that animates all life, human and more than human, in the world. So, that terminology, which by the way, is less and less used. It again is pretty associated with the boomers. It seeped in a little bit to the Gen X generation, to my generation. But as students in my classes aren't even familiar with it. When they hear it, they think, oh, that sounds okay. But it's less of a thing than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Thank you. My other question, because you obviously have read many books, are you familiar with Linda LaScola? And
Not off the top of my head.
was she and Daniel Dennett
Oh,
wrote
yeah.
a book, Caught in the Pulpit?
Yes, I do know that book.
Which I think is an amazing book. And it's interesting because I'm a member of the Clergy Project. They started this thing called the Clergy Project, and one of the screeners for people coming into the Clergy Project estimates that 25% of college-educated clergy are atheists and are caught in the pulpit.
Yeah, I'm not, when I was doing the research on choosing my religion, a number of clergy people and lay people who were really active in churches. A lot of my work was funded by religious or religious associated groups. I got a lot of funding from the Lilly Endowment, for example. And so I went to a lot of religious conferences, and routinely, I mean, like every single time, I'd be going to the restroom or taking a little break or something, and somebody would come up and say, I'm a pastor of this Lutheran church. I've been there for 20 years. I love the community. Don't believe in any of the teachings. I mean, just routinely. And so, you sort of have to ask the question, you sort of have to ask the question, well, why are people there? And that for me becomes this very, it sort of goes back to, Emile Durkheim's idea of religion creating social cohesion, providing a structure for that. And for a variety of reasons, there just isn't presently a different kind of social structuring that does that work, that allows people to gather, as I said, allows for the creation of different kinds of ritual practices that help us to move through our lives and on our different life stages. And increasingly, even people who are in those communities recognize that that's most of the work that it does in their lives. And so, I know lots of, when I go to, I didn't this year, but I usually go to the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, which is the largest gathering of scholars in the United States every year. And, in the most religious-y of settings, people will talk to me about the fact that I just had a colleague who's a professor at a seminary, like just recently, who said to me, no, I just don't believe in any of it. And, you know, she's teaching students how to be pastors. So that's a continuing deal. And it's not just in religion, although religion has been a central part of that, where we're losing the sense of what is the institutional structure that allows us to thrive as a society, that will allow us to do that. Politics doesn't seem to be doing that of late, perhaps of forever, but certainly of late. We're seeing some of a new, I think, institutionalized cosmopolitanism in social justice movements like the Black Lives Matter movement that are decentralized, but creating some kind of cohesion and have a clear but adaptable moral framework that seems to matter to people. And so these, I think we're going to see different kinds of institutionalization happening over the next generation, but we just don't know what that looks like. And so I think when you see clergy and other actively religious, like if I belong to an Episcopal church, it wouldn't be because I believe that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, because I don't. It would be because it was a place where I could do meaningful work in the world.
Thank you. That's a beautiful lead into my talk next week.
Awesome.
All right. Paul, now you can go.
That was the perfect segue to my question. In the description on the Humanist website, it talks about you also direct a living religion collaborative, which was a term. Is that an organization specific to Santa Clara University, or is it a part of something beyond? And what is it anyway?
It's a project in our religious studies department that focuses on engaging with the local religious and non-religious landscape. And so we work on developing courses and and all of us who are fellows in that collaborative, doing research and publication that focuses on religion in local contexts and how students can be more engaged with that. So we're mostly materialists. We look at the actual landscape, actual people, actual social phenomena, and study the role of what difference the presence or absence of religion or non-religion makes in the local landscape. So for example, a colleague and I are doing research on the relationship between religious presences and absences and the Googleville development on outcomes in local communities. So it's a kind of a working collaboration between some of our faculty and local religious and non-religious communities that allows our students to kind of put their hands in it rather than seeing these phenomena as just a set of ideas that they might reflect upon from afar without considering how they engage actual human and more than human lives.
I was also curious about, I see that you have a seminary degree from Graduate Theological Union. About myself, I was born in a parsonage, grew up in the Methodist Church, seminary degree from Garrett in Evanston. And at each of those places, there were people who were really secular, but that was the structure that we knew. And my father in his preaching talked as much about social justice issues as he did something that others might have referred to as spiritual things. That good is as good does. I think would have been his approach. I just wondered about your experience at Union. Were there many who were really secular people who were simply interested in the study of theology?
Well, let me just say I don't have a seminary degree. I don't have an MDiv or a DMin. I don't have a degree in ministry. I have a PhD. It's an academic degree. So the GTU is a consortium of a number of seminaries that do offer seminary degrees, so degrees in ministry. But the doctoral program is completed in relationship to UC Berkeley.
Okay.
So it's an academic research-based
Right,
degree.
right.
So there are, in some ways, the GTU functions as the no longer existing religious studies department of UC Berkeley. So that's my academic background. I do have a degree. I have a master's degree in Roman Catholic systematic theology, but again, that was an academic degree, not a pastoral degree. There have been lots of people in those contexts who are full-on secular, who are looking at the role of religious and non-religious and extra-religious phenomenon in shaping various aspects of culture and society and personal experience.
Thank you.
All right. So I have Dana and Jerry. It's right at 12:30, so this will be the last question before we go to just general discussion.
I have a question about organizations like the Green Party, which has a lot of, ethical and moral kind of considerations in its 10 key values. And we were very active from about 2000 until
2008.
2008. And I think it kind of, in a way, as I look back on it, I think it sort of filled a kind of role because it was more than just a political party. It was a political party that embodied all of our values and social justice concerns, and it really seemed very meaningful. And I'm wondering whether political parties could ever fulfill something of the role that churches previously did.
They can't do. There's lots of scholarship that suggests that religions, it's fairly clear, for example, to religion scholars pretty much across the spectrum that evangelical Protestantism is less a religion than a political party. You can see that in the way in which Ralph Reed was involved in structuring evangelicalism to foment certain kinds of political engagement as specifically a political operative. So on that end of the spectrum, you can see politics functioning as religion. However, lots of scholars also feel that as people have become increasingly non-religious, other cultural forms that provide opportunities for gathering, that provide ethical frameworks, that do these kinds of ritualization, that contribute to feelings of personal growth and fullness, to use Charles Taylor's term, have taken the place of religion. For some people, that's political organizations. For some people, it's sports. Right, where organized sports can be a source of identity, have a certain kind of ethical framework about some measure of maybe fair play, or maybe win at all costs, depending on whether or not the Raiders are involved. Some organization, some other, it does their ritual things. They're sort of the cathedral of football, the cathedral of baseball, the cathedral of soccer. There are godlike figures, all of that. And politics has that same thing. So again, if you look at it from a sociocultural perspective, a functionalist perspective, then you're asking the question, well, what does it do? And if the Green Party for you does this kind of work of helping to provide a social self-identity, helping to provide a sense of shared commitment, ethical practices, you meet on a regular basis, there's specific things you do, you have certain kinds of idiomatic language and idiomatic symbols, then yes, for many people that can take the place of religion, can function in a religious way in the same way that religions can come to function politically or function in other kinds of ways. So for scholars who study religion from a sociocultural perspective, that functionalist approach that really is looking at what's the concrete experience that people are having in the context of their everyday lives, not an idealized, abstracted experience that would be studied in theology, for example, but what functionally is happening. Lots of other kinds of institutionalized experience do that work. The issue is that for a long time in the United States and in other parts of the world, religion, whatever the normative religion was, did that work for the majority of people, and that's no longer happening. So there are places now that will do that institutionalizing work for cohorts of people. This is why, and it's beyond the scope of what we're doing here, and we're out of time anyway, but this is why I think institutionalizing forms of cosmopolitanism are really important, because there is this sense of, at an overarching level, at a macro level, how do we create ethical frameworks, practices of social cohesion, practices of social and individual betterment that work in a wide cultural form without creating some kind of hegemonic structure that that elevates some expressions of that and suppresses other ones.
Thank you.
And I have a question too, which is, why do non-religious students go to a religious university like Santa Clara?
Because they think they'll get a better job.
Really? Why?
It has a very good reputation.
Yeah, I mean, some of them, their families come from Jesuit traditions. So it's in the Silicon Valley. It has, strong placement in the fields that are attractive here. People get jobs, they get into graduate schools. It's a relatively small private liberal arts campus in Northern California that appeals to a certain demographic. It has, for most people, very little to do with its religious affiliation, other than it might be part of a family or community tradition to do that, in the same way that somebody might go to Georgetown or Notre Dame. It's I mean, we can't boast that we have a good football team because we don't have one at all. But there are lots of other reasons that people choose religiously affiliated organizations, and some people do feel like there's a certain benign, even if they're non-religious, benign ethical value to a reasonably progressive, moderately progressive institution like Santa Clara.
Yeah, I can kind of understand that. I learned about the Marcellus Center a while ago. I don't know of any other university that has anything like that. Mm-hmm. And I can relate to not having a football team. And my college did not have a football team. They decided it was too dangerous. So did my high school. Oh, I'm done. Thank you.
I just wanted to make, I want to unmute. Yes, I want to make one comment that my impression of free thought and atheism is that between the world wars, I think there are a lot of atheists, but they get involved with the Socialist and the Communist Party, which was, technically secular organizations, and it provided quite a framework for them. And I think it was after the Cold War started that there was a tendency of the government to emphasize the religious nature of the U.S. and to downplay and to basically drive free thought underground. It's when we added under God to the Pledge of Allegiance.